All right. I am now joined, not for the first time, by Victor Bruzzone and Ethan of the Mouthy Infidel channel for another breakdown. How you guys doing tonight?
Pretty good.
I'm doing well.
Good. So yeah, this is something, I was interested in it when you first did it, and I thought it might be an interesting, break in terms of the sort of mix of topics that we like to do here. But Victor, I think you were the one who originally found this, so you want to set this up for us a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So, in a way, the reason for searching for it is I think it's a question that's always been interesting to me. Even before I actually started studying philosophy in school, I remember when I was like a teenager, my brother introduced me to, I don't know if you heard of them, the teaching or the learning channel. I forget. They're like these lectures. And like, for example, like Robert Solomon had really good lectures on existentialism. And I remember there was one about the mind and AI. And back then I was like probably in my I was in my angsty atheist phase. So then I saw this guy making an argument for like why computers couldn't be minds. And I was like, what is this guy? Like, is he going to argue like for God or something? Right. I was like so suspicious. I was like, he's going to be like the fact that he was questioning that computers could like create consciousness. I was like, he must have some magical reason for thinking that that's impossible. And then like I remember listening to it and being like, oh shit, like this is actually really, it's different. It's not what I expected. And even though I never really ended up studying philosophy of mind that much, I think I took like one class in undergrad. This was always kind of one of those early experiences with philosophy that always like has fond memories for me. So when we were talking about topics, I just wanted to see if there was some debate that included Searle, right? And then I just found this old 1984 one, which might be interesting. I'm not familiar with his debate partner, but I think they're basically debating this question of strong AI, so hopefully it'll be interesting. I didn't actually really watch it beforehand.
I mean, I was obviously familiar with Searle. I was not familiar with Boden. Just put in the description we put on the stream, I call her cognitive scientist. That's based on a quick scan at Wikipedia. But certainly in terms of my my relationship to this stuff, somewhat similar. I mean, I never took, I guess technically speaking, I did take one class in graduate school that was on philosophy of mind stuff. But I have to say it's one of those, I was not very engaged in that class, and I don't remember very much from it. So it's like one of those things where it's like you can sort of do the grad school thing where they kind of like don't give you as bad a grade as you deserve, and like just to like shuffle you along when you half-ass a class like that.
Yeah.
Like as I don't know, I guess other stuff I was taking at the same time, was more compelling to me, and I don't even remember all of what we talked about in there. But undergrad, I remember actually one of the first sort of analytic philosophy-ish classes I took as an undergraduate at Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Was a class called Minds and Machines, where I remember reading David Chalmers in there, The Conscious Mind. That thing had probably not actually come out that long ago when we took that class. Remember reading a lot of that stuff. And at the time, I don't know, for some reason, like I think that I assume that they'll get into this in the discussion, but like for people who aren't familiar with it, actually, does one of you guys want to take a quick stab at like doing like a pithy summary of like the John Searle, the Chinese room thought experiment?
So I actually think he does go over it in the debate. That was one thing that I did check. So I don't know if we want to like spoil it in case people, because it's just so riveting. I don't know if we want to spoil it ahead of time.
Okay. Well, fair enough. All right. Well, if they talk about the debate, we can.
I did hear that part that I heard him start to explain it like pretty early in the debate when I was checking it out. So.
All right. Fair enough. Well, in any case, this is an argument against the possibility of, you used the phrase earlier, strong AI, meaning artificial intelligence that's not just like does a really good job of replicating what a mind is like for various pragmatic purposes, but would actually have thoughts, experiences, would
Qualia,
yeah. So like there would
Ethan's
be
favorite.
yeah, well, this is actually something I want to talk about because I'm actually very curious where you guys fall down on all this stuff. One of the interesting things about this for me is like it's going to be a relatively rare experience for me of like commenting on a debate where I actually don't particularly have a dog in the fight. I don't really have, I'm not really super committed to any particular view about any of this stuff at this point. I can tell you what I thought in 2003 when I was adamant about it, but I don't really know what I think in 2000.
Well, what were you adamant about? I'm curious what your adamant position was.
Yeah. So, okay. So yeah, you used the word qualia just now. So again, I don't want to assume people are coming in with this. So this is like roughly the idea. It's like, Thomas Nagel has this famous phrase, there's there's something that's like to be something, right? I remember, John Searle, writing somewhere that it's like, okay, it's really uninteresting that you could just describe something as an input-output system because you can describe anything as an input-output system. It's like the pen on my desk, it's following a very simple program, stay there. But, that doesn't tell us anything about, certainly consciousness or anything like that, right? So people who are really into artificial intelligence, or I don't know if you read certain kinds of science fiction, like this assumption is just like all over the place in there, sort of assume that any sufficiently complicated and sophisticated computed system just would be conscious, there would be something that it was like to be at all that, right? And then I want to just warn you guys in advance, I'm probably gonna have to do the intermission music for just a second because there's gonna be a phone call. It's gonna be coming through the computer, but it'll just take a second.
Yeah.
But Searle rejects that, right? He thinks that, and he thinks that the mere fact that you could program an AI that would be really good at sort of replicating the results of consciousness isn't a good enough reason to think that it would actually be conscious. And back when I was an undergraduate taking this class, it was like pretty much me against the professor and like the two other people in that class who cared. I was like adamantly on Team Searle in that. Like I was totally convinced that he was right about that. And yeah, I don't know. So I think at this point, I'm just kind of agnostic about it. I think that both about that specific question and also about sort of larger issues about philosophy of mind, because, I think there's some pretty obvious reasons to assume that some form of materialism is true, right? I mean, what is our minds like magic? Come on. That's silly, right? But none of the sort of specific versions of it, like functionalism, which is the main thing that Searle is criticizing, really feel quite convincing to me. Like it always feels like there's a little bit of a shell game there, that it's like we're sort of talking about topics that are kind of in the vicinity of what people are really asking about when they ask about consciousness. You're sort of pretending that the answers to those questions are the same as the answers to the consciousness questions, but they don't quite seem to be the same questions to me. And I sort of, I don't know, I can, this is one of the areas of philosophy that I have the least of a take about, because I feel like any time that I devote a lot of time to thinking about it, I just feel like I must be fundamentally confused about something, and I suspect that everybody else is too, but I'm not sure exactly what. So I guess that's where I land. I don't think circa 2022 I actually have a position on this, that, I'd be happy I guess it's like that Huxley line about how Darwin lets you be a fulfilled atheist, right? I would be happy if somebody came along with a view about philosophy of mind that I found totally convincing, so I could be a fulfilled materialist. But I kind of think I'm not yet. So that's where I am. But I'm curious about where you guys are. Victor, well, actually, Ethan, Victor kind of mentioned, he sort of alluded to your views earlier. And again, my apologies if, we're literally about to get a pizza. They're gonna like, they're gonna call in to Buzz, and my wife has the phone, but it usually rings to my computer. So if I have to put on the intermission music in the middle of you talking, that's why. I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not. But in any case, so Victor kind of alluded to your position, but do you want to kind of spell it out a little bit?
Yeah, I'm not super committal. Me and Victor had talked before. I'm sort of sympathetic, certainly probably more sympathetic than most people, to like the sort of Dan Dennett, Keith Frankish position. Just in the sense that like I'm super hesitant about, more robust views like substance dualism, in part because I worry about there's this dilemma of like, okay, are we going to be epiphenomenalists and say that consciousness is real, but that it doesn't have any causal impact, because that doesn't seem right? Or are we going to say that consciousness is non-physical and that it does have a causal impact? Then it seems like we'd have to reject like causal closure of the physical. And it seems like there's a lot of scientists who are saying that our best theories involve causal closure of the physical. So then the question is like, okay, well, this thing qualia, can we reduce it to some physical phenomenon in some intelligible or convincing way? I'm not sure if we can. I'm not super, I don't find it super problematic to just bite the bullet that like Dan Dennett wants to bite and just say like, yeah, this thing called qualia and the features that we associate with it are kind of just like illusions. And basically, once we have like a more completed science, a lot of the things we sort of, associate with consciousness and our folk theories will end up being not located in like a more mature scientific worldview. And in part, I'm motivated by the thought, like, it seems like already a lot of our conscious experiences, like we keep finding out that more and more of the things we think about our conscious experiences end up being wrong. And so our sort of access to the reliability of our conscious experience and our introspection is, I think, a lot less fallible than a lot of people think. So I'm open to the idea that like qualia is just kind of a folk concept that ends up being like an illusion or not really real. Or maybe there is some compelling like physicalist reductionist account that ends up explaining qualia in like a satisfying materialist way, but I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, and by the way, we're I'll just usually I do this without saying anything, but I'll just give people a tantalizing peek behind the curtain here and say I'm going to go full screen so I can have my slice of pizza when we start the debate. But I do, I guess Jen caught it quickly enough. It didn't go to the computer, so I'm good. But in any case, yeah, no, I hear that. I mean, again, I don't really know what 2022 Ben thinks about it. I can channel 2003 Ben and like tell you what I would have said about all that then, which is like that it's like all that I just kind of feel like okay, but like even that terminology, like an illusion, right? An illusion is you're experiencing something that's different from reality, but what we're talking about is experience. And so it's like, how can that be an illusion? That there's something that doesn't quite compute about that to me, or certainly didn't then. And and it's certainly true that I mean, everything you say about psychology and introspection, that that you can there are all sorts of ways in which our introspection is like super flawed, but I mean that seems more like when we try to sort of capture in the abstract exactly what we're feeling, or we sort of try to remember it 3 seconds later or whatever, then there are distortions there. But again, that's like now what we're this experience that we're having is different from this other experience, and that all seems very internal to this world of experiences. So this is the kind of thing that used to drive me crazy back when I was convinced that Searle was right about this. But I also do agree with the half, with half of what you say for sure, right? That it's like the other half of the dilemma is like, okay, but like Gilbert Ryle has this famous phrase about how you used phrase substance dualism earlier, the idea that consciousness is just this other thing that's like somehow interacting with the physical world, and this non-physical thing is like ordering around the molecules in your body when you like say, I'm going to lift up my hand, to use as an example, right? That looked a little Nazi salute-ish, actually. That's but like, okay, that seems like, it's like, okay, like Ryle calls that the ghost in the machine view, and that seems obviously crazy. Like, okay, that can't be right. So then to me, I start to have this frustrating feeling that like all of the options seem obviously wrong. So there must be some other option I'm not thinking of, but I have no idea what that could be like. I don't know. Victor, do you have a view on this?
I think my view is pretty similar to yours in that, like, I don't really have, I was definitely convinced by the Searle view when I first read it, but I mean, now I'm doing my PhD in political theory, so I really don't think about, or I'm not up on reading philosophy of mind, so it's been a long time. But, I will say in somewhat recent memory, I remember being at parties with, some kind of like, I guess like computer science bros, and they were like big fans of like, how much we're going to get to that point, the singularity. And I remember kind of like deploying some of Searle's arguments with a lot of delight in that situation to kind of show how they were making assumptions that implied some kind of like immaterial soul, because like, if some think you can download your consciousness onto a computer, which kind of accepts the same assumptions as in some ways like the immaterial soul, just in like a different way.
So like this is a rhetorical move that Searle makes that I remember loving in 2003. That like because it lets you turn the tables and accuse everybody else of being a Cartesian dualist.
Exactly. Because they think he's like, you think that you're being some like hardcore materialist, but like actually you imply some immaterial consciousness, like, which is like really weird and spooky when you think about it. So but I also like, I'm similar to you, Ben, in the sense that obviously like in a robust sense, I don't really have like a strong view about it anymore either, because I'm just not up on it. But
yeah, I mean, what those guys would presumably say, or at least the sort of like versions of them who knew more about philosophy of mind, is like, well, no, this is no more of a problem than say the same program could be implemented on different bits of hardware at different times or something like that. I don't know. Is any of that quite convincing? I don't know, man. I just do like logic and Marxism and stuff. That's above my pay grade. But let's start the debate. Let's see what Searle and Boden think.
Good evening. It isn't hard to think that there's something unique and indeed mysterious about the race of man. For a start, there don't seem to be others like us around. Still, large items of belief or faith that support the perception of our uniqueness and mystery have been given way. The rot set in, I suppose, when we learned from Galileo that we don't have the prime position in the universe at its center. We then turned out, or so it seems, not to be the children of God. To come up to date, no doubt what most supports our pretensions to uniqueness and mystery is the belief that our mental powers of understanding and creativity, and our mental capabilities generally, are our special preserve. We alone have the physical equipment, the brains, which are the means to understanding and the like. There's now an intellectual growth industry whose tendency it is to remove our claim to distinction, partly by way of a new conception of mind or mentality itself. The industry is called artificial intelligence, inspired by extraordinary developments in computer science, which some would argue are taking us into a new culture. Many who work in artificial intelligence are confident that they have a model of the mind, a model of us, which is more precise, fertile, and enlightening than anything from philosophers, from Freud, from benighted psychologists who attempt to reduce mentality to behavior, or from neuroscientists, present or future. It's certainly not a model that makes us special. There's no doubting the confidence of the new industry, the confidence of, may I say it, the artificial intelligentsia. Computers themselves are not the main interest of those who work in artificial intelligence, who seek to bring the mind out of its obscurity. They're not that much concerned with the hardware. They're quick to say that intelligence or creativity or understanding or consciousness are not to be seen at bottom in terms of mechanisms and boxes from IBM, or in terms of our brains, or in terms of any other physical structures or materials, dead or alive, constructed or evolved. The hardware, including the neural hardware in our heads, doesn't matter. It's the software that counts. A bit more precisely, it is programs that count. Very roughly, they are the rules on which computers run. They are the rules, if the proponents of artificial intelligence are right, on which we run. One question which arises for us tonight, then, is whether minds are just computer programs of certain kinds, or rather just programs, since certainly they don't need to be on computers. Can it be that the mind is yet less than a ghost in the machine, but just as an abstract sort of thing? Is it true, then, that computers have mental states, that we shall find out about our minds by studying theirs, that we shall find out about our consciousness, intelligence, creativity, presumably our desires and passions, by studying theirs, that our future is perhaps a bit uncertain, since the computers of the future will have what we have and a whole lot more of it? Professor Margaret Boden of the University of Sussex is, as I trust she won't mind my saying, the doyeness of artificial intelligence in these islands. She's lately been elected a member of the British Academy. Her books include Artificial Intelligence and Natural Man, which surveyed its subject most fully, and Minds and Mechanisms, which collects together some of her many papers. Professor John Searle of the Department of Philosophy of the University of California at Berkeley has among his present attainments this year's Reith Lectures for the BBC, and among his attainments of the past, a first-class row. It was caused by his article, Minds, Brains, and Programs, was first published in a professional journal along with 27 replies, including many from the world's leading proponents of artificial intelligence. It was and is his contention that there is no reason to suppose that computers have or ever could have thoughts or feelings. He has perhaps further doubts about artificial intelligence. He allows that a myth has grown up, the myth of the computer, but he believes that soon enough it will give way to what I'm sure he calls good sense. Could we begin, Professor Boden, with some of your views? I think it would perhaps be useful to have an idea of what you take a program to be.
Well, a program, as you said, is just a set of rules for basically for moving symbols about. But an AI program is a very different sort of program from the ones that we're normally used to, because an AI program is one where there is a rich representation of the world that the system is thinking about inside the program, if you like. And this is why AI is of interest to psychologists and also, I think, to philosophers of mind, because it's concentrating on what goes in between the input, the perception, if you like, and the output, the behavior. It's concentrating precisely on something which is in the same place, if you like, in the function of the organism as the mind is, something which the behaviorists, for instance, totally ignored.
Right. So programs then are at least fundamentally sets of rules, but very rich sets of rules. Is it true, in virtue of programs, that consciousness might be ascribed truly to future conceivable computers? I think you've said that they might properly be ascribed concepts. Do you stick to that view?
I think that they might properly be ascribed concepts, yes, but I think there's a difficulty with words like consciousness or even purpose and intelligence, freedom, any of these words, and that's basically not a factual difference. Not a factual difficulty, because I don't see any reason in principle to doubt that in fact you could have a computer system which had the same sorts of events going in it, computational events, which we have in our minds when we, for instance, make a free choice. I think it's a moral difficulty. I think that once you agree to take the scare quotes off, words like purpose and intelligence and freedom, and you say, if you're prepared to say that a particular computer program or robot really is free, for example, then what you're saying is that it's part of your moral universe, and that all things being equal, you've got to respect its purposes, unless they clash too much with your own. Now, I think that's a very strong moral thing to say. I personally wouldn't want to see the day in which we said that. I would want to keep a distinction between the purposes of naturally evolved creatures, including chickens and cows, and the purposes, in quotes, of artificially created creatures, such as computer programs. But I think I should say that that's my view. It certainly isn't a view that would be shared by everybody in AI. I think most people in AI would say that since I've agreed that in principle there's no factual difference here, they would want to go the whole way and say that in principle there could be a computer which was really conscious, which really had purposes, which was really intelligent.
Mm-hmm. So we think and have beliefs, and computers think in inverted commas and have beliefs in inverted commas. Is the difference between those two contentions only one of a moral character? Did I understand you?
Well, at the moment, it's a difference of fact. I mean, even the most powerful and impressive AI programs that we've got today hardly begin to scratch the surface of the sort of power and complexity that the human mind has got. So there's no question whatsoever that you can't use these terms except in a very weak sense about today's programs. Again, I personally believe that will always be true. I don't actually believe that in practice we will ever build a computer like HAL in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. I don't think it'll in practice happen. Again, other people would disagree with me, but I think that in principle that's possible.
Right. John Searle, you have strong views on the subject of artificial intelligence, and I think those views focus on one argument.
Yeah.
And it's something about a Chinese room.
Well, let me tell you a little bit.
I wonder if you would tell me what it aims to prove and then tell me what it is.
Okay. I like to talk about particular programs and the sort of thing that's claimed for them. So let's take as an example the Yale program at the Yale Artificial Intelligence Lab for understanding stories. That's understanding it in quotes. The way it works is this. You give the computer a story. These tend to be rather simple-minded stories. Here's a story. Man went into a restaurant and ordered a hamburger. When they brought him the hamburger, it was burned to a crisp. So the man stormed out of the restaurant without paying the bill. Now you ask the computer, did the man eat the hamburger? And lo and behold, the computer says, no, he didn't eat the hamburger. Now that's an interesting result because you remember it didn't say in the story whether or not the guy ate the hamburger.
One up for the computer.
One up for the computer. Okay, now, and that's presumably doing something we could do. That is passing the test that we would test, but we would expect a child to pass for understanding the story. Okay, how does it work? Well, the computer has in its data bank, in addition to the story, it's got a representation of how things go on in restaurants called a restaurant script. And it matches the story and the question against the restaurant script before it gives the answer. Now, what are we to make of this? Well, what I call the strong AI people, and I'm really not sure Maggie is one of them, but the people who are sort of the gung-ho fanatics in AI say, this proves that the computer literally understands the story. Now, I think I can demonstrate conclusively that it proves no such thing, and in fact that the computer doesn't understand the story.
And is that understanding without inverted
No
commas?
quotes here.
No kind of funny
honest to John understanding. Right. I mean, and to their credit, a lot of people in AI insist that we are using these words in their literal sense. Simon and Newell say the understanding we attribute to the computer is the same understanding we attribute to human beings. Okay, what I ask you to imagine is this. I like to do it in the first person and have everybody do it from their own point of view. Imagine I'm locked in a room and I got a huge box full of Chinese symbols. I don't know any Chinese, just so many squiggle signs to me. Now they bring in another box full of Chinese symbols and they give me a bunch of rules in English for matching these symbols. So it says, take a squiggle sign out of box number 1 and go and put it next to a squoggle sign out of box number 2. Just to jump ahead a second, that's called a computational rule over formally specified elements. Okay, now let's suppose they give me in another little batch of Chinese symbols together with some more rules in English for shuffling these symbols around. Only this time I give them back, the chaps who are giving me all this stuff through the window, I give them back some Chinese symbols. So here I am in my room with my 3 bunches of Chinese symbols. I'm shuffling symbols around. Symbols are coming in and I'm shuffling them back out. Now imagine, unknown to me, the guys who gave me the first box call it a restaurant script. The second box they call a story about a restaurant. The third bunch of symbols they call questions about the story. The rules in English they call the program. The answer, the stuff that I give them back through the window, they call answers to the questions about the story. And me, they call the computer. Now, let's suppose that after a while, they get so good at writing the program, and I get so good at shuffling symbols, that my answers to the questions are indistinguishable from native Chinese speakers. So the story comes in, I don't know what it means, just a bunch of symbols. But the question follows, did the guy in the restaurant eat the egg foo young? And I give back the symbol that means, no, the guy didn't eat the egg foo young. Now, I pass the test for understanding the story, but I don't understand a word of Chinese.
I think that is the Turing test.
That's so-called
Could you say
Turing
a word
test.
about that?
Well, Alan Turing, a great British mathematical genius, invented the test for determining whether or not we should attribute understanding to the computer. And the test was, could the computer fool an expert? So let's suppose that I can fool the experts. My answers to the questions are as good as those of native Chinese speakers. Imagine they even give me a question of the form, do you understand Chinese? And I give them back answers that mean in Chinese, of course I understand Chinese. Why do you guys keep asking me these stupid questions? Can't you see I'm passing the Turing test? Now, here's the punchline. This is the point of the whole analysis. I do not understand a word of Chinese. And if I don't understand Chinese in this example, neither does any computer, because the computer has exactly what I have. The computer has that and nothing more. It has a set of formal rules for manipulating symbols. It takes symbols as input, it manipulates the symbols, it gives symbols as output. And if I don't understand Chinese, which I obviously don't, there's no way any other digital computer could understand Chinese or anything else, because all it has is uninterpreted formal symbols. Or just to put this again in one last sentence, and that is what the computer has, and Maggie described this very well with the programs, is a syntax and not a semantics. What it's got is a set of formal rules for manipulating uninterpreted formal symbols. But what human beings have is not just a bunch of symbols. We know what the symbols mean. You give me a story in English and I know what it means.
So what the computer has is rules for putting terms together, but no rules specifying what terms stand for, something like that.
And furthermore, it couldn't, because suppose you tried to give a
I guess one thing is I do feel like he went over what the Turing test is like so quickly that it would be easy to blink and miss it. So this is funny, actually. I remember like 9 years ago, I think there was a Hollywood movie that came out about Alan Turing called The Imitation Game, which the name of the movie is a reference to the Turing test, but they never actually say anything about the Turing test in the movie. It doesn't come up in the movie, which I can only assume that it was, part of some original script that ended up getting cut, and they just kept the name of the movie, or in some incredibly subtle way that I missed. You were supposed to get it out of the movie or something. But it is interesting because if people who know a little bit about Turing, may know that. He's one of the people who's most responsible for the sort of foundations of computer science. Computers as we know them today. He was a code breaker in World War II, helped defeat the Nazis, and then he was, to simplify a little bit, essentially murdered by the British government by sort of forcing him to take medication that I think ended up leading him to become suicidal, to de-gay him, because it was like the late 40s or early 50s and people thought that worked. But in the all of which I'm just saying because it contributes to why this would actually have been interesting if in the movie that included something about the test, because the original paper that he wrote, I remember reading that Minds and Machines class back in 2002, whenever that was, had the way it starts out. It's like the original Imitation Game that was the inspiration for the Turing test was apparently some sort of like weird British aristocratic party game where like they'd have somebody who was in a room, or two people in a room, maybe one was a man and one was a woman, and they would have questions passed into them, and they would pass out answers. And I think they were supposed to use typewriters, so you couldn't tell by the handwriting. You were supposed to guess who was the man and who was the woman. And he said if people weren't able to identify whether they were talking to a computer or a human, as often as they were unable to identify whether they were talking to a man or a woman, then we could safely conclude that the computers could really think. That's more or less what the Turing test is.
I didn't know that it came from a game. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Whose cat is that, by the way? Is that?
Oh, that's my cat. He's
because I know Ethan has one too. So
yeah, I'm pretty sure that's Shabazz though. He doesn't. I mean, whatever. I mean, if he does need anything, Jen can deal with it. But I seriously doubt he needs anything. He just sometimes he just likes to wander around meowing.
Yeah, for sure. On the Turing test, this is like slightly off topic, but I think I was thinking about it recently. Are you familiar with like the ideological Turing test? Because I think that's like an interesting good faith.
No.
I forget who invented it. I mean, I don't know if Ethan knows, but like the whole idea is like, if you pass the ideological Turing test, if you can like say back to your like debate opponent or your like political or ideological adversary, if you can say back to them like their own position that they accept in a way that they would be like, yes, that's correct. If you can kind of blend in, if you can go and hang out with libertarians, for example, and they can't tell that you're not one of them because you're saying all the right things and you're saying it charitably in the way that they would say it, right? Then you're passing the ideological Turing test.
That's interesting. I feel like I might be able to do that with libertarians. I feel like I would absolutely be unable to do that if I was like hanging out with like Sora Bramari and Patrick Deneen and I had to pretend to be like a Catholic integralist. Like yeah. I am 100% sure that I wouldn't be able to pass the test.
Yeah, that would be a hard test to pass for sure.
Yeah. So anyway, okay. So he's given the basic thing. I don't know if this is going to come up later in the debate, or I don't even know how much of a debate this ends up being at this point, although it does sound like it should be a little bit of a one, because she did say in passing that she does think strong AI is possible in principle. So, maybe there is like a fundamental disagreement there, although I think Searle is slightly slippery about whether he's saying that there can't be, or just that like the Turing test wouldn't tell you that you achieved it. Because he does say, I remember someplace like, well, look, there's nothing about like silicon that like necessarily means that, it couldn't be conscious. But, or I don't know, maybe he doesn't say that about silicon. He definitely says
he does,
something.
I think.
He does, okay.
He does, but I think his point is more like the material maybe doesn't matter. It's more just like the method of using computation and symbol manipulation. Like it doesn't matter what you do, but then I think he likes to say like, but I'm not, he's like, I'm a materialist. So like, I do think that you could probably make an artificial brain one day. Like, I don't see why you couldn't, assuming that like the human being is a machine and the brain is a machine of some kind. He's like, we can maybe make a brain, maybe it could be out of silicon, but he's just like, as long as you're using the kind of computational paradigm, he's like, in principle, it would be impossible, I think is his view.
I wonder if sorry, go ahead.
Can you say those last like two sentences again, Victor? I just want to make sure I got it.
Oh, like so he's just saying like he's a materialist, so he thinks that like you could in principle make an artificial brain. He's just like, we have no idea how to do it right now. Right. He's like we just have no idea how the brain works, but he's like, in principle, if you accept that the human being is a machine and the brain is a machine, well, in principle you can make that machine some other way. He's like, but as long as you're using the paradigm of computation, which is using symbol manipulation, in principle it's impossible to get consciousness from that, he thinks.
Gotcha. Yeah, that does sound very familiar. Ethan, what were you saying?
I wonder if what John Searle thinks about Boden's point about, it was interesting because based on how she started it, I thought that I was going to have more contention with Searle, but then she went on to make this claim about machine minds, even if existing, like wouldn't matter morally. I wonder what Searle thinks about, because I can't think of like, it almost takes me back to like Peter Singer's argument for like animals mattering. It's like, in virtue of what trait are you
Right.
going to say like all humans are valuable, right? Because humans have different levels of like intelligence, different physical capacities. It seems like the only way you can say all humans are of equal value is if you value them based on like their subjectivity and their consciousness. But then like, how are you going to bar machines or animals from moral consideration? It's not clear to me.
Yeah, that was weird.
It's a good question. Yeah. I mean, like, especially because the way she said it was like naturally evolved creatures matter more. It's like, well, why should that matter
Yeah.
morally? That's a moral distinction.
Yeah.
It's like you didn't like you sort of imagine some like conscious robot in a science fiction story that's like feels pain and stuff, and you're like, sorry.
Yeah. Or like, have you seen the movie Prometheus?
Yeah, I have.
Unfortunately, yes.
I think didn't it turn out at the end of that movie that humans were like the product of some like weird god
Right.
creature like planting a seed? Like, so
I
it seems
believe
like on her view, right? Like we would end up just not mattering if that turned out to be the case.
Well, actually, the really fun thing about her view is that if creationism was true, then
Yeah.
we wouldn't matter.
Yeah,
Right?
true.
Like we're just lucky that we evolved. That it's if we had been intelligently designed,
Yeah.
we wouldn't be morally significant.
Right. That's funny.
I like it. All right, let's keep watching.
A computer an interpretation of the story. So you feed in more symbols that say in Chinese, the symbol for egg foo young means a certain kind of egg dish made by putting in a whole lot of soy sauce when you cook the eggs. Well, there's no way that the computer can know any of that because what it gets is just more symbols. That is, any effort to give an interpretation of the symbols results only in more symbols, and that's by definition what a program is.
Right. Professor Boden, that argument, as you know, has enraged a lot of people. I wonder if it enrages you.
It enrages me a bit too. You shifted, John, from talking about a specific example, the Yale program with the restaurant script and the hamburgers, to talking about any computer. Now, I think that was a bit naughty, because if you stay talking just about Shank's program, I entirely agree with you. These things do just shift symbols around. They've got no sense of what a restaurant is or a hamburger or anything else. I entirely agree. But then I think there are two things that you would need to add to that sort of program to get a program which was much nearer to having genuine meaning, genuine intentionality. One is, as you said yourself, you've got to have some semantics plugged in. Now, how are you going to do that? I agree you cannot do it in principle purely by adding more formal rules, which by definition aren't interpreted in terms of things in the real world. And I think that you've got to have some causal relationship built into the computer, just as it's built into our brain, into our retina, whatever, in order to establish the semantics, in order to establish the reference. And you've not only got to have sense organs, if you like, taking information in causal commerce with the world, you've also got to have the thing, manipulating things. So if it doesn't, if the egg foo young has a certain chemical in it, it will spit it out, as we do. Now, if you say that reply isn't really very clear because there's all sorts of questions, all sorts of problems you could raise about whether I really have plugged semantics in, I would say you're absolutely right. But then I would say we don't understand from the philosophical point of view clearly what semantics is in the human case. We don't understand what it is for you or me to refer to that glass. So to be fair, we shouldn't ask for a clearer account of semantics in the AI case than we ask for in the human case. That's the first point I'd make. The second point is that I also think there's a little bit of a sleight of hand when you talk in this dismissive way about shuffling symbols. You imagine this man having the table with, you look up squiggle, squiggle, and he looks across and you find squoggle, great, squoggle, squoggle goes in this box and out of the window. Even the programs that Yale have at the moment, and as I said before, those are absolutely minute and paltry compared with anything that would have genuine psychological interest in explaining what understanding might be. Even his programs are much, much more complex than that. And not only much more complex, but they involve a wide range of sorts of internal representations which model, if you like, and we'll put all the scare quotes on, okay, things like beliefs, desires, intentions of the person who's listening to the story and emotionally reacting to it, of the various characters in the story. And anything which is going to be all, a candidate for being the same sort of thing as a human mind has got to have all that. So I entirely agree that his program doesn't have any sort of semantics, but I'd like to know what you'd say about the programs of people like David Marr or Geoffrey Hinton, which are programs, basically they're visual programs, and the point of interest here about them is that they're built in what's called dedicated machines. That's to say, they're built in machines which, like the retina of our eye, has got special little bits in them which react to the light coming in a certain way, so that they can suss out what the three-dimensional shape of something like this is, given that they're only getting a two-dimensional image in. Now, what would you say about?
Well, let's take both of these points. First of all, the point about complexity. It seems to me my argument has nothing to do with the simplicity or the complexity of the program, because the point is a perfectly general point. The point is that however simple or complex the program is, in order that it be a computer program, it has to be defined purely formally. The whole appeal of artificial intelligence, and indeed the power of computer science, is that one and the same program can be instantiated in an indefinite range of different kinds of hardware, precisely because it is defined purely formally. So I would say, as far as the Chinese room is concerned, make the program as complicated as you like. Put in as many representations of as many facts about the world as you like, and the argument remain exactly the same. I still don't know any Chinese, because in the way that the system is set up, I have no way of attaching any meaning to the elements in the program, to the symbols that the program operates over, regardless of how complex the program is. So I think the issue of complexity is a red herring, but I don't think that's your main argument. Your main argument, if I understand you correctly, is it's causation plus the program that gives us the mind. Now, I already want to say that is an abandonment of AI as it's traditionally conceived, because now we're not saying the mind is a program. Mind is to brain as program is to hardware. What we're saying is it's program plus causation. So let me consider that, if I may, for a couple of minutes.
Is it causation on the way into the computer or causation on the way out?
The way Maggie had it, I listened very carefully, the way
Right.
Maggie had it is both. And I think that's a more powerful, that's the argument I'd like to challenge, because that's a more powerful argument.
So if you had a computer with a good program attached to a robot,
Right.
and it was causally affected by the environment, and in turn acted causally so that it behaved,
Right.
then on Professor Boden's view, it would understand in inverted commas, and on your view, it would be nowhere near it. Is
That's
that it?
right. Let me go through what I think would be the strongest version of Maggie's case. Imagine a robot, and it's got television cameras attached to its eyes, and it's got a motor apparatus attached to the computer in its skull. And it takes in visual stimuli, and let it use the MAR program to process the visual stimuli. It goes through the primal sketch and all of those things. And then it has motor output based on the set of interfaces between the sensory input and the motor output. In short, the way we've described it is much like the way a lot of people who believe in the computer theory of the brain describe the way that our brain mediates sensory inputs and motor outputs. Okay, I want to say the Chinese room applies exactly to that case. Imagine that in this robot, there's a big room in the robot's skull, and I am in that room. And what comes into me from these from the television sets are a lot of Chinese symbols. And I have no idea where they come from. I'm just paid to sit in this room and follow the instructions and shuffle the symbols around. Now, I then pass back certain symbols or put them in the appropriate slots and push the appropriate buttons. And unknown to me, what I'm doing is mediating the sensory input to a motor output. But all the same, what I have is what any digital computer has. Formal symbols, uninterpreted, and you can give them any causation you like. As long as there's no mental representation of that causal relationship, they give me no way of attaching any meaning to the symbols. So let's take an actual case here. Here I am, and I'm the robot's brain now, or I'm, if you like, its homunculus. And the robot eats egg foo young at this point, and a symbol comes into me that means egg foo young. Unless I have some way of knowing the causal history of that symbol, that is, unless I have some mental representation of the causal relationship, I still don't learn any meanings of any words. That is, as long as the form of causation isn't mental causation, that is, as long as it's just ordinary physical causation, it won't give me the meanings of any symbols.
Well, I mean,
meanings seem to be the crux here.
Yes, I mean, can I make two responses to that, John? The first is that you've weakened your homunculus. In the story that you just told us, you aren't the robot. You aren't even the robot's brain. You are a subsystem in the robot's brain. Now, there are lots of subsystems in our brain, lots of distinguishable psychological processes which are used, for example, in understanding a sentence or even in working out what the syntax of the sentence is. Now, nobody would want to claim, I think, that one of those processes actually understood what syntax was in the sense in which you and I, as human beings, understand it. So that you cannot cheat by cutting off the semantics, by ignoring the fact that there are these causal relationships with the outside world with this robot, and having a truncated homunculus where you've deliberately, got rid of the semantics. That's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing I'd say is that when we talk about causation here, it's very important to realize that there are two sorts of causation that we need. One, which we need to get the meaning in, is the plugging into the world, the causal commerce with the world in the way that we just talked about, what you might call pure physical causation. That light comes into my eyes, makes things happen on my retina, and that this body in the world touches that and it moves in physical space. Okay, but in between that, there is psychological causation, what you called mental causation. Now, I would want to say that that psychological causation is best understood as a series of computations which ultimately are anchored in processes with a genuine causal semantics, if you like, of the sort that I've been mentioning. But when Ma, for example, talks about vision, he doesn't just talk about the way in which the light affects the cells in the retina. He then goes on, as you know, to talk about a number of different levels of representation in the visual system, which are needed even just to work out something simple as what the three-dimensional shape of that glass. And each of those levels of representation is defined by him very carefully in terms of a set of symbols, which might conceivably have been different, and each of which is defined in terms of the more primitive symbols at the level below. And ultimately, of course, you've got the level at which the eye is actually functioning as a physical transducer, namely, you've got a plugging in of your semantics causally into the world. But we mustn't forget that there's physical causation in that sense, which is crucial, but there's also mental, or I would prefer to say computational causation.
The crucial point in my analysis is that since the formal computer program has no semantic or mental content by definition, then any artificial system that is supposed to give it mental content will have to do something which is equivalent to what the human brain does.
Yes.
Now, that's because that's what the human brain does.
Right.
But on the way that you've described it, and incidentally, in my reading, for example, I was supposed to be the whole brain. That is, it isn't that there are a whole lot of other brains in there. I am the entire brain. I do all the MAR processing as well as other sorts of processing. Now, on that way of describing it, there is no way that the causation plus the symbols could produce any mental content, because there's nothing in the system that performs functions equivalent to those of the human brain. Now, let me take these two propositions because they are crucial to the argument. We got one out at the beginning, namely, syntax is not semantics. The syntax of the program by itself doesn't give us semantics.
Right.
Now, the second proposition, which is implicit in my account, is brains do it. Brains cause minds. Now, if you take those two together, then we know that the way that the brain does it can't be solely manipulating syntax, because that the syntax isn't enough by itself. Now, what you suggested is, well, let's add causation to the syntax, and that way we'll get what the brain does. But the answer to that is, the only way it would do it would be if you added something that was more than what any digital computer has, namely something that was biochemically the functional equivalent of the human brain.
Well,
I think at this point I have to say that your answer will come to that in just a few moments when we will come back.
Good place to stop.
Yeah, I have some thoughts, but I'm curious about what you guys think about the back and forth so far.
Yeah, I mean, I'm enjoying it. I think there's a couple things there, it seems like the like main kind of point of disagreement is like what exactly constitutes semantics or like meaning or like and I think she raised kind of an interesting question about the fact that he wasn't exactly at the beginning, at least, defining what that means. But ultimately, I mean, I'm remaining sympathetic, I think, to Searle here.
Yeah. Well, actually, let's hear from Ethan first.
Yeah, I think I'm more sympathetic to Searle's view than I thought I would be when we first started the debate. Because I originally took his position to be, like minds can only be in the types of organisms that we are, but it seems his argument's more like, given the framework of, how computation works, you can't have a mind in a program that's basically just manipulating symbols according to certain specified rules. Yeah, I think I'm pretty sympathetic to that view. Although a lot of what they're talking about, like we started out in philosophy of mind, which is like a subject I don't know as much about, and now we're getting into like meaning and semantics, which I know even less about. So I'm trying my best to follow along, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my sense so far is that I sort of feel like Boden kind of has the better of him on some of these specific arguments. Like I think she's like giving the like really sharp responses, but there's still something that he's like putting his finger on that like bothers me. And like there still seems like there's something there. I mean, I think that yeah, I mean, there is something very intuitive about his perspective about all this. I do think, I do think that, put this, like, I do think that one thing that seems like she's been pushing in a lot of her responses, which is like a really good response to Searle, I think, is, okay, if you just describe symbol manipulation, then it's very easy to sort of get the intuition that's like, okay, well, that's obviously something different from semantics, understanding, consciousness, whatever, which are, maybe different concepts, but I mean, like, just for our purposes right now, we can just lump them all together like Searle is. Like, but then, and you say, oh, well, see, computers are only doing that thing, therefore it's not consciousness. And brains are doing something else. But then, like, the obvious follow-up question is, okay, great. What's the something else that the brains are doing? Like, once you kind of nail that down, then, like, we'll have a better idea of whether we can get computers to do them. And I think that Searle doesn't have a great response to that in his back pocket. I mean, like he sort of says, well, brains are interpreting the symbols in ways that give them semantic or mental content or whatever. But, like, okay, so what would it be? What is the extra thing besides symbol manipulation and causation that allows brains to do that? And if the answer is then I don't. It's really hard to know where to go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think he at the end, and I think someone in the chat pointed this out, he just ends up kind of appealing to biochemical processes, right? Like, and I think I agree that's like a
photosynthesis. I remember that from reading Searle many years ago.
That's true. Yeah, he does talk about that. I think and I think like
photosynthesis, it's a biochemical process.
Yes, exactly. So he appeals to that, but like I think both kind of like the strength and maybe weakness of his view is that like his view kind of depends on the idea that like, well, we don't really know how the brain works yet, right? So like, but he's like, but in principle, it doesn't seem to me that it's anything magical. We just don't know how it works yet. It's like, that's a good thing. But I agree, it also leaves the door open. Well, then what's this extra thing that the brain is doing if it's not symbol manipulation? I think for him also part of it, which I don't know if it's going to come up in this debate, is just like that by accepting that symbol manipulation is sufficient for some kind of consciousness, then you accept a whole bunch of other ideas that I think he finds unacceptable, like the idea that consciousness, if it's just a program that is symbol manipulation, then presumably you could produce consciousness on anything that is just manipulating symbols, right? You can make. I think I've heard him say something like, "Oh, you could do like a bunch of beer cans that are like put together to run in a program that bang into each other that then isn't somehow connected electrically to then you could create consciousness on that, right?" So I think he might, hopefully he'll like kind of talk about that, but yeah, it just kind of leads you down this road where you're like, okay, well, literally anything could be conscious then.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of so as much as I'm sort of uncomfortable with the racial politics of all these examples made about China. There's also something called the Chinese nation thought experiment, which is like, could like some vast group of people, like the entire nation of China, if they arrange themselves in certain complex ways to relay messages and stuff, would that become like a collective consciousness? And if you think that that's wrong, then you should think that like mere complexity isn't good enough. I think. I mean, I might be getting this slightly wrong, but I think that's the point of that example.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think you're right. Yeah, like that's a good example of kind of what I was talking about. Well, like because if you have like a coordination of people to like run the program the exact same way that a computer is running that program, then that you would have to accept that that's conscious if you accept the computational view.
Yeah,
which seems very unintuitive.
Yeah. Off topic, but Charles says, by the way, am I the only one drowning in Warnock emails and texts? My brother, you are not. I voted for the guy. I am going to vote for him on the second round, when the runoff happens. But like every single day, I block a few of those numbers on my phone.
Oh, yeah. You guys I guess you both must be in Georgia. I mean, I'm definitely not getting any of those up here in Canada.
Yeah, you're not getting them up in Canada, but I think plenty of people who don't live in Georgia probably still get it like fundraising stuff.
Are you getting any, Ethan?
No, I still get. It's weird because I don't even remember like linking my email or anything in any context. I get a lot of emails from Elizabeth Warren. And I swear to God, last time I checked my email, or one of the last times I checked my email, which is rare, I just see an email from Elizabeth Warren that says like, I wish I could have called my daddy today. And I'm like, well, I don't know what these emails are about.
This kind of relationship. Yeah. No, I was, my favorite fake ones were the messages from Nancy Pelosi. It's like, God damn, Nancy, I keep blocking your numbers. You got to stop. But I guess now it'll be Hakeem Jeffries. But
I was gonna. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, kind of back to the Searle debate. I wanted to mention as well that I know that like one of the famous responses, and maybe he'll talk about it here, like to the whole Chinese room thing, is some people will say, well, of course, like the symbol and manipulator isn't conscious, but the whole room is conscious, right? Like that it's like somehow there's an emergent. So a lot of people like to respond.
Yeah, the entire system is conscious.
Exactly. They try to have some kind of an emergent property argument that it's the consciousness emerges from, which doesn't really seem very intuitive to me, but I get the impulse in a way.
Yeah, I mean, which is kind of what. I mean, even though she didn't put it in exactly those terms, that does seem like what Boden was pushing with a lot of the exchange just now. That she says, well, okay, like when you're talking about these like very simple computational systems, then it seems unreasonable to say they're conscious. But like this is the kind of idea that people have that it like this is somehow emerges at a sufficient level of complexity or something, which, I mean, I think is both sort of intuitive, like it does seem less ridiculous when you get up to a sufficient level of complexity, but then like you think about it from a different angle, it's like, wait a second, why should that matter, right? Like that's, but I will say that in his explanation of the homunculus and all of that, it that did, I think, feel very prone to that, because it's like that did, and I think she called him on this correctly, like that did kind of sound more like we're imagining something that's like much more within the brain than even the whole brain, that like it really did sound like he was describing like one part of a cognitive system So it's like, yeah, sure, that thing doesn't understand Chinese or whatever, but like, is that really like, I mean, this is so like in terms of this sort of like deflating the intuitive punch of the Chinese room, I think the idea that there's something about the guy in the room that's like dissimilar from like a whole person who would speak Chinese, and that therefore maybe if we're thinking about, the AI in a larger context, or the AI embedded in the right kind of physical system or something, to be more like a person understanding Chinese and less like some sort of module in the Chinese speaker's brain. I mean, I think like at least sort of rhetorically, that's a good strategy. I'm not sure, I'm not sure how convincing I really find it or not.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's keep going.
John, you were saying before that certainly programs aren't sufficient for mentality, to wrap it up rather quickly. But on top of that, that there's some limit or there's some restraint such that only certain sorts of things could conceivably have consciousness or mentality. And I think, Margaret, you were keen to suggest that he was mistaken about that.
Well, not about that in the abstract, but I didn't like the way that John put it, because he talked about systems having the functional equivalent of the biochemical nature of the brain. And I think that that could easily be taken as a mystification, even if a materialist mystification. Of course, it's true that if visual pigments that you find in eyes were the only chemicals in the universe that were capable of responding to light, right, then only brains could support vision. Certainly that's true. And there may, as a matter of empirical fact, be certain sorts of chemical interchanges going on in our brains which can't have any sort of functional equivalent anywhere else. But I see absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe this. I mean, the important point is not what is the biochemical nature of the brain, but what are the functions which that biochemistry is subsuming, is supporting? What are the computational functions it's supporting? And I see no reason whatsoever to expect that there's something special or magic about protoplasm, such that there are certain computational functions which only it, in principle, can perform.
There's an interesting way that I think your remark begs the question by saying that what the brain does are perform computational functions. So let's go over this. There are two propositions that form the basis of my argument. Both of them seem to me to be obviously true, and what I'm really trying to do is work out their consequences. One is syntax is not the same as semantics. You don't get semantics from syntax alone. The second is, just as a matter of biological fact, brains cause minds. That is, specific brain processes cause mental states. Now, if you put those two together, you don't get the result, and I certainly didn't mean to imply that only brains could cause minds, that a system would have to have a brain like ours to have a mind. But you do get the following result. It's a trivial consequence of the proposition that brains cause minds, and that is anything else that was capable of causing mental states would have to have powers, specific powers equivalent to those of the brain. Now that maybe Martians do it by having a lot of green slime in their head, or maybe you could do it with silicon chips. But you know that if the brain does it, then anything else that did it would have to have powers equal to the brain. Now, if you go back to the first proposition, namely syntax is enough, you know that the way that the brain does it can't be solely computationally, because you know that all the computation does is operate over formal symbols. You furthermore know, and this is another logical consequence, that if you build an artifact, a robot, or something else that did it, you would have to have more than just the formal syntactical processes. You'd have to have something that duplicated the powers of the brain. Now it becomes a question, well, what kind of systems would do that? Now here's where I really part company with AI. The strong AI position is any hardware whatever that had the right program, and I gather you want to add to that, any hardware whatever that had the right program together with the right causal relations to the external world. Okay, but that would have the consequence, for example, But let's suppose we build one hell of a big computer out of old beer cans. You can make computers out of anything. You can make them out of men sitting on high stools, or you can make them out of water running through pipes. So let's build a computer out of old Watney's cans. I don't know if we're supposed to mention particular labels, but anyway, old beer cans.
You've done it.
I've done it. Okay. We have millions, billions of old beer cans banging together, and they're powered by windmills, and we got the right inputs. We have transducers that transduce photons, so we got a perception of light. Now, I want to say it just seems to me incredible that this system of beer cans would have the biochemical properties of the human brain. And I want to say, now here's my main objection to AI. AI doesn't say, for all we know, beer cans might have thoughts and feelings. What AI says, if they've got the right organization, they must have thoughts and feelings, because that's all there is to having thoughts and feelings, is instantiating the right program.
Professor Boden, are you committed to the view that a pile of old beer cans with the right causal connections
And the right program.
might be said to
Must have.
have a mind or whatever?
Well, in principle, in as strong a sense as any computer could be said to have a mind. I mean, I already said earlier in the program that I personally wouldn't want to say that it did for basically moral reasons. But as I said, it isn't, in my view, it isn't a factual impossibility. But can I pass, actually, John, from the strong AI position, which we've been talking about, and which actually isn't really my position anyway, speaking personally, from the strong AI position to the weak AI position? See, I personally am not primarily interested in computers. I'm interested in the human mind. I'm interested in how it works, how it relates to the brain, and what the hell goes on up here, right? And I'm interested in AI because I think it gives us a way, far and away the most promising way that I can see at the moment, of thinking about these things and of asking a new set of questions using some of the concepts that computer science has given us, and of making hypotheses, suggesting hypotheses which are much more rich, much more precise, much more complex than any we've had before, and which also have their own dynamism. I mean, you can see what their results are by putting them into a computer and letting the thing run. And I think from the point of view of theoretical psychology, this is very interesting. I've already mentioned that I think that some of the work in low-level vision in AI has been psychologically very useful. Not that it's given us the answers about just what's going on, even about that, but that it's given us some very interesting ways of asking new questions. And there's already been, I think, some genuine advance there. But let's get off that topic, because somebody might say, well, you know, who's really interested in how you get from 2D to 3D? It's pretty boring. Let's take something like, I don't know, creativity. Which is one of the things that people always bring up as what they regard as an obvious counterexample. You know, you couldn't possibly come to understand human creativity better by thinking about it in this sort of way. Well, I'd like to make 2 points there. First of all, there's no alternative, because it seems to me there are two theories, in quotes, about creativity at the moment, neither of which are at all helpful. One is basically it's divine. I mean, Bernard Levin, the theatre critic, actually stated so in 2 pieces in the Times a couple of years ago when the play Amadeus about Mozart was running. He actually claimed creativity is divine and couldn't possibly be explained by a human psychology. The other is that it's not divine, but it's sort of superhuman. It's something special. It's intuition. It's something which perhaps all of us have, but some of us have to a much greater degree, Mozart, for example. But it's unanalyzable, it's special, and again, it's not something which science, never mind computers, which science could explain. Now, that seems to me to be defeatist. I mean, it may be true, but we'd better look a bit harder before we decide that it's true. And I'd like to ask, you know, how intuition works, what it means to say that something was found out by intuition. And I'll just take one example and just for you to kick around, I'm sure you'll be happy to. A program written by a man called Lennart. I pick it not because it's a very, very impressive program, but because it's the most impressive program so far in this sort of area. It's a program which explores mathematical ideas. It doesn't just do sums, you know, according to preset rules. It actually kicks around the ideas in its mind, so to speak, changes them, transforms them, combines them, and asks itself from time to time, have I got anything here which looks as though it might be interesting? And if it finds something which it thinks might be interesting in terms of criteria it has, so mathematical interestingness, then it concentrates on that, and tries to prove theorems and so on. Now, to cut a very long story short, and omitting all the technicalities, this thing, has come up with a large number of ideas which it labels as being interesting, which mathematicians also would agree are interesting, things like prime numbers and square roots and so on. It's even come up with one theorem which was a new theorem in the theory of numbers. Nobody in the whole history of mathematics had ever thought of this before.
It's certainly passing the Turing test.
It's passing the Turing test. Now, and it's doing this, as I say, by having rules which are, if you like, rules for exploring. And I think basically that's what creativity is. It's a question of exploring the structures in your mind, putting some of the concepts together, changing some of the constraints on your structures that are in your mind, not necessarily consciously. And that this is what's churning underneath in our minds, underneath what we call intuition.
Well, it seems to me we've now got several pieces on the board. I'm not quite sure where your final position on strong AI, that is the view that computers literally have thoughts and feelings, is. But I want to insist that even in this case of the theorem proving program, if it really is a formal program, I mean, we've had these theorem proving programs for quite a long time now. It would not be a case of actually having thoughts. It would be a case of simulating the production of proofs. I mean, the actual prints out proofs.
Look,
but let me finish.
But I think it was the creative production.
Okay, let's talk about creativity.
Well, A, it wasn't a theorem prover in the ordinary sense, but B, I'm not interested for the moment in the question about whether or not you can say that that program is really creative. What I'm interested in is whether or not we can understand human creativity better by thinking about it in terms of this analogy. If you like.
But, okay, and that seems to me a factual question. I mean, this seems to me an question. I can state it as precisely as I can, and that is, are the principles on which the human brain operates, that is to say, those principles that are crucial for such things as creativity, are they fundamentally, or do they fundamentally involve some digital elements? That is, let's grant for the sake of argument that strong AI is false, that the computer doesn't literally have thoughts and feelings. Now then, well, what good is it in the study of human psychology? Well, one line would be, and it's one that I would agree with, it's a very useful tool. It's a useful tool in studying human beings in the way that it's a useful tool in studying avalanches or patterns of rain in the Midlands or the economy of South American countries. It's just a very useful tool. But there's a stronger view, which I think you hold, and that is, we have very good reason to believe that even if the program isn't sufficient for having mental states, that it's nonetheless necessary for having mental states, so that we can study creativity by studying machines. While they don't literally have thoughts and feelings, nonetheless do something analogous to producing human creativity. Now, let me tell you why I'm a little bit suspicious about that. First of all, there's a long history of identifying whatever is most puzzling to us about the mind and the brain with the latest technology.
Sure.
So in my childhood, I mean, nowadays we're told the brain is a digital computer. When I was a boy, we were always told it was a telephone switchboard. What else could it be? And if you go back to Freud, Freud always identifies the brain, or analogizes the brain to electromagnetic and hydraulic devices. Sherrington identified the brain with telegraph systems. Leibniz compared the brain to a mill. And I'm told there were some Greeks who thought the brain functioned like a catapult. So we ought to be suspicious of
some brains do
of fixing our model of the brain on whatever's the latest technology. And the real question is this: it seems to me that I haven't seen a shred of evidence to show that psychology is best understood on the computational metaphor. Regardless of the truth or falsity of strong AI, the claim that the key to understanding psychology is to see the operation of the human mind on digital principles seems to me to have been totally unsupported.
When you said that, of course, you agree that the computer is a useful tool for thinking about the mind, just like it's a useful tool for thinking about hurricanes or whatever. Now, I suppose what you meant by that was it's a useful tool because it gives you precision and it can work out the results of your theories for you quickly and so on. I mean, which is not to be sneezed at. No other psychological method has got it. Agreed. But I certainly would want to claim, I'm sure you dispute, that it gives us more than this in the case of psychology, though not in the case of hurricanes, namely that some of the concepts that were developed in computer science in order to build these machines to do vaguely interesting things are the best that we've got at the moment. The most promising concepts that we've got at the moment for thinking about what goes on in the mind.
I think they're not the best set of tools, and I want to suggest some better tools. And I think, in fact, one of the pernicious things about AI, even though it is a useful tool, one of the pernicious things is it distracts attention from what really are the fundamental problems in psychology. Now,
Well, before we get to the better tools, maybe this is a good place to pause. I saw somebody say, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it now, here we go. So Schmegley says, isn't Searle saying if we can make a machine that works like the brain, that it would have a mind? Doesn't that put him in agreement with Boden? I think he is saying the first thing, sort of, but he's not saying the second, it does not put him in agreement with Boden, to the extent that Boden is actually defending strong AI, which gets very confused in that part that we just watched, but we can get to that. But, a version of Boden that was clearly unambiguously defending strong AI, I think they would still be disagreeing. So the disagreement would not be about whether you could perhaps, or at least whether we can rule out the idea that you could have conscious things made of silicon chips. I think Searle says, oh, maybe. But I think what Searle is primarily objecting to is the idea that all it takes to get consciousness produced by something other than human brains is just that it fulfills the same computational structure as whatever our brains are doing. And he says, no, computational structure isn't good enough. That's what the Chinese room and all that stuff is supposed to be. So it's I think Searle is a little bit slippery about whether, because when he says, oh, it's a biochemical process like photosynthesis, that makes it sound like what kind of hardware we're talking about is really important. But I think he's maybe a little bit agnostic about what it is about our brains by virtue of which it gives rise to consciousness. So maybe you could have something that's made of silicon chips that gave rise to consciousness. Certainly you could have stuff. He's very clear that you could have stuff that's, that the Martians' green slime brains could give rise to consciousness. So it's clearly not that there's something magical about the material in our brains. But again, I think it's a little bit hard to pin down because I don't think he has a really clear theory of what it is about our brains by virtue of which they produce consciousness. It's just something, and I think computational structure.
Yeah, I think it's important to just emphasize for sure that he's not trying to make room for any sort of view the soul or anything like that. Like he's definitely a materialist in a certain sense, or a naturalist. He thinks it's a natural process. He just thinks that on a computational paradigm, it's just not going to produce it for all the reasons that he said.
Yeah.
What
were you gonna say?
Well, I was just gonna say, I think, and actually, you made me think. Also, I know more recently he's gone into arguments with, I don't know, that there's that singularity guy. I forget what his name is, or people who talk about computer simulations, right? If you could simulate every single atom.
Like Ray Kurzweil, maybe.
Yeah, Ray Kurzweil, that's it. And then people who say, oh, well, if you could simulate a brain in a computer, right? So you could simulate every single cell down to the subatomic level, then wouldn't that become conscious? And I remember this might be where his photosynthesis example sometimes comes in, where he'll say something well, you can simulate photosynthesis, you can simulate digestion of a hamburger in a computer, but that doesn't mean digestion's actually happening. Right, it's you can just
is the kind of metaphor that really makes it seem like he thinks there's something special about the actual kind of meat that our brains are made of.
Yeah, which might be what he means by biochemical processes, right? He might think that there's just something about the particular configuration of the meat, right? Which you're right, but it's not special in the magical way. It's just maybe more particular. It's it's particular but not special, maybe, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah. Kurzweil, by the way, is a really entertainingly insane example of the strong AI stuff. So as Dylan points out in the chat, he wants to bring his dad back as a computer. That's literally his position. I remember like 10 years ago, the article about him in the Rolling Stone, where he was like, yeah, I've collected all these materials, like, memorabilia from my dead father. So eventually when we get computers good enough, I can like feed in all of this information and it can recreate him. And it's like, okay, assume that Searle is 100% wrong about all the philosophical issues and functionalism is 100% right. Even according to functionalism, that wouldn't be his dad, right? I mean, that would be something that in a very, very vague way, resembled him. Like if it's based on like surviving records.
Yeah, I think it gets more interesting if you can like plug in all of his dad's like memories and intentions and so on that he held.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't see how it would be his dad.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting though about the kind of simulation kind of like response, or like if we could simulate everything, is like I think it does kind of fall victim to like a kind of unstated assumption that like basically like all like that prioritizes in a way information as what or maybe I don't know if I'm going to be able to explain this properly, but like kind of assumes that the most important thing about like consciousness is like something kind of immaterial, which is like the qualia or whatever. Because if you can just simulate it through information kind of like manipulation, and you were like, okay, well that gives you consciousness. And I think Searle's point with when he tries to appeal to biochemical processes is to be like, not try to escape materialism, but actually like kind of double down on it and be like, well, no, like the material matters in a way, right? It's like you're, and that's where he likes to accuse them of falling victim to a kind of dualism, right? Between like, the immaterial information, right? Versus the actual like computer or silicon or whatever, or the brain, right?
Slight tangent, but somebody in chat said this is getting complicated. Where's Dave Rubin when you need him? I sympathize a little bit. Like there are points here where like I'm digesting something that was just said and then they're moving on, and I'm like, I wish Dave Rubin would just cut in to give some speech about like how happy he is that we're allowed to have these conversations.
Yeah, so that'll give you time to process what they're saying.
Yeah, it's true. It is a complicated conversation for sure.
Yeah, the guy who's actually moderating is Ted Hondrick, who I don't know a ton about, but he's an academic. I guess this is funny because like this sort of thing that it's like, I don't even know exactly what this like show is or whatever, but it's like this sort of the idea that there's like some academic who like moonlights like hosting, some kind of like public television show about his area of expertise or whatever. Feels like something I don't really know from my experience, but I feel like I kind of know from like, I don't know, old Philip Roth novels and stuff. That would be like that would be something that would like come up, and I think literally there's a Philip Roth novel where that came up, and it's like old media like fiction would like sort of refer to this as a thing that existed. I don't think I've ever actually seen an example, but
it's true.
The main thing I know about Ted Hondrick is that I remember from the late 2000s that he had some kind of feud with a dude who I actually did take some a class from at the University of Miami, who is Colin McGinn, now disgraced celebrity academic, who was he ended up having to leave University of Miami because there were like these like emails that came out where he was like sending his research assistant messages like I gave my I remember one of them in the emails was and this was like a little bit of a pun or call back to something in like a class that he taught, but it was, I gave myself a hand job this morning thinking about you giving me a hand job.
Oh my God.
And then he claimed the first of his many lines of defense, which he blogged about at the time, was that Americans just didn't get his British sense of humor.
So I guess him and Searle have that in common, I guess, because Searle also disgraced academic.
Yes, they do have this in common. This is true. This is biographical fact.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think Searle said to one of his graduate assistants, who might have been Asian or something
Yes, I
like
remember
that,
this.
something about like, oh, I'll show you colonialism or something like that. I forget. Something.
Yeah, that was like his pickup line. Yep. Yeah, there you go. But yeah, so Colin McGinn is the guy I'm describing, to be clear, not Hondrick.
Yeah.
But like McGinn had some kind of feud with Hondrick. I actually just looked it up while I was watching this earlier part. This there was this the Lighter Reports, which is a sort of I don't know. It's been years since I read it, but it was, among many other things, it sort of operated as like kind of an academic philosophy gossip blog at one point, and
still around, I think.
Yeah, it's still around. I don't know what kinds of stuff he posts now, but I remember this old post on there from 2007, which I just looked up, called "Colin McGinn Not Like Ted Hondrick's Book," and it quotes the beginning of Hondrick's McGinn's review of Hondrick's book, where he says, "This book runs the full gamut from the mediocre to the ludicrous to the nearly bad."
Nice.
But anyway, I don't know. So it's enemy of Colin McGinn, which I guess is is a feather in his cap. But I don't know anything else. I don't really know anything else about him other than the fact that apparently he had some kind of weird public television philosophy gig.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a British thing too, like a BBC thing. Like, because I know in Canada too, like we actually have a long tradition on the CBC of having, since the 70s, like kind of public programs that would be about philosophy, like something called CBC Ideas that I think you can find. Oh, I don't know if Ben disconnected or if.
Oh, I just took myself off screen, so
okay,
I could let the cat out of the room again.
Oh, okay, nice. Yeah, but anyway, yeah. So like we had there's something which is still on CBC Ideas where they have like conversations about philosophical topics. But I guess, in America, you guys had like the PBS, which would maybe do some stuff like that. I guess even not to really call William F. Buckley an intellectual exactly, but like he had his whole firing line thing, which was pretty highbrow for the time, I think.
I think Fire Line is kind of great. Obviously it's like somebody with like horrible reactionary views who's controlling the mic, and sometimes that's frustrating. But like, also like he had Michael Harrington on there, he had Norman Thomas on there, like
Chomsky, of course.
Chomsky, yeah. And they'd have like pretty long, in-depth conversations. Like obviously that's something you can have now on like YouTube or whatever. But in terms of old media, kind of ironically, Buckley's political views, it's really hard to imagine that existing anywhere but PBS.
Yeah,
like any like normal commercial television station where they had to worry about whether people were going to stay for the next ads.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I guess my last, if you have anything else that you wanted to pick back up on, either of you, feel free. But like my last thing before we go back to it is just that like I was a little disappointed in this last batch by Boden, because I thought she was doing a really good job of like arguing against Searle on the strong AI stuff earlier, and then in this last part she just inexplicably like gave that up.
Yeah,
it was like, no, but I really want to go back to my.
I noticed that
poorly explained thing about how, for moral reasons, we shouldn't describe consciousness to machines.
Yeah.
Yeah, didn't she also just accept his whole like beer can computer thing? She was like, "Yep, that could be a."
Yeah, no, you can have beer can computers. Why not? Anyway,
or like beer can consciousness.
I want to go back to why, for moral reasons, we should exclude robot consciousness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that was really strange, because it's like she seems to be saying like if AI has a mind, then I'm committed to saying that it matters. And I do believe that AI has a mind, but I don't want to be committed to saying that it matters. So I'm just going to say it doesn't have a mind or something. It doesn't make much sense. It's like, if you don't think that something with a mind matters, right, then like clearly it's not the mind that matters. And if you think that like for sure having a mind is what matters, then you just shouldn't have trouble saying that AI matters. Yeah.
Maybe it's just that I feel so much more confident about what I think about moral philosophy than philosophy of mind, but it's like I really want somebody to press her about that.
Yeah.
All right.
believe the basic notion in understanding the operation of the human mind is the intentionality of the mind. That is the ability of mental states and events to represent objects and states of affairs in the world. So I'm thinking not just of belief and desire and hope and fear, but also of perception and voluntary action. Now, this feature of all of these things, namely that they refer beyond themselves, which philosophers and psychologists call intentionality, that feature seems to me the fundamental feature in understanding human psychology and human behavior. It's no exaggeration to say, at least I think it's no exaggeration to say, that intentionality is as fundamental to psychology as atomic theory is to physics, or as the theory of tectonic plates is to geology. Now, here's the problem with AI. Instead of addressing intentionality on its own terms, what it does is address a formal analog. And it gets us to think that really what we really ought to be studying is not, for example, consciousness. Notice there's very little about consciousness in AI and very little about it in contemporary psychology, partly because they bought this information processing model. You've heard very little about consciousness in this discussion. But conscious and unconscious forms of intentionality are the fundamental notions that we're going to have to use in explaining human behavior. Now, consciousness and intentionality are themselves grounded in the brain. They're grounded in the neurophysiology. And the great illusion that AI palms off on us, is an illusion that's persistent in the social sciences throughout this century, is that in addition to the actual functioning of the brain to produce mental states, and in addition to the mental states themselves in all of their tediousness and glory, that is actual conscious and unconscious mental states, that there's got to be some intermediate realm. Now, for a long time, it was supposed to be behavior, and now it's supposed to be some computer program that's supposed to mediate between the neurophysiology, between the level of the hardware, the level of the plumbing, and the level of the mental phenomena themselves. So I want to say that our basic notion in understanding human beings, it's the one we've known all along, is not the idea of a formal computational process operating over some abstract formal symbols. There's no reason to suppose that that's how human beings work. The way they actually work, as far as we know anything about it, is first they've got brains, they got these neurophysiological engines, and those brains produce mental states, which themselves function causally by way of their intentionality.
I quite agree that from the philosophical point of view, the basic notion of psychology is intentionality. I would say not consciousness, intentionality. Although, of course, any adequate theoretical psychology has got to be able to deal with consciousness. So I entirely agree with that. And I would use that as a stick to beat those sorts of psychology, like, for instance, behaviorism, which have had no place at all for that. But I want to say a few things about that. First of all, intentionality isn't the same thing as consciousness. For example, the experiments...
No, we agree on that. There are forms of intentionality that aren't conscious.
There are forms of intentionality that aren't conscious. That's the first thing. The second thing is that really nearly all theoretical psychologists, including Freud, took consciousness for granted at the philosophical level. They took it for granted. After taking it for granted at the philosophical level, some of them went on to ignore it at the empirical theoretical level too. Some of them didn't. But certainly it's not true that theoretical psychology is only concerned with consciousness. Also, it's not true that AI or computational psychology influenced by AI is the only form of psychology that has taken that philosophical fact, if you like, or that philosophical domain for granted.
No one says it's the only branch of psychology. My point was...
Okay, now let me say something more positive than that. I think, now obviously we disagree, one of the specific reasons why I find AI of philosophical and of psychological interest is that it seems to me to be a promising way of thinking precisely about intentionality.
Yes, and the way that it does it, the way that it does it, and this is really one of the consequences of the Chinese room argument, is that we can now show this, the way it does it is by changing the subject. Instead of taking intentionality on its own terms, what it does is try to construct a formal analog of intentionality.
But we don't know what intentionality is on its own terms.
Well, we do indeed.
We have no philosophical account of it.
But we do indeed. Well, I've just published a philosophical account of it, and
we have no non-controversial, universally accepted account of intentionality.
We have no non-controversial account of anything in this field. I mean, so that's hardly an objection. The point, however, is this. In the case of AI, what we have is the illusion that we don't have to study intentionality on its own terms. That is to say, either in terms of its own logical and psychological structure on the one hand, or its physiological underpinnings on the other. What we can study is this purely formal analog, which we study completely abstractly.
Well, I would like one example of a flourishing or a historical form of theoretical psychology which is done better.
Well, Freudian psychology, for example, uses intentionality throughout. Now,
It assumes intentionality throughout. Yes, indeed.
What Freud does is very interesting. And incidentally, I'm certainly no fan of Freud, and what I think you're pointing to is the general impoverishment of psychology as a discipline, one thing I entirely agree with. But from William James through Freud, just to mention two prominent examples, much of the best work that's been done on human psychology uses straightforward notions of intentionality. James and Freud don't use the jargon.
Right.
Freud often talks as if he's doing some kind of hydraulics of the mind. He uses all these electromagnetic and hydraulic metaphors. But when you actually get to the clinical practice in Freud, the explanations are intentionalistic.
Yes, but you see, I quite agree with that. And if you asked me to name one psychologist who's closest to AI, of course, not counting the very recent ones who know about it, I would pick Freud. Precisely because Freud was concerned with the transformation of symbols. He was concerned with the relationship of meanings, with the way in which symbolic meanings come together and are compared, and the way in which a memory is structured, and so on and so on and so on. All his stuff about parapraxis, slips of the tongue, all this stuff seems to me, in principle, makes very good computational sense.
Yeah,
so I think it's a very strong example for my case.
Freud and AI are both talking about symbols rests on a very deep pun. I might almost say it's a Freudian pun. Because when Freud talks about symbols, he meant real symbols. Something actually stands for something else. Now, the problem with AI is, and here we're back to the Chinese room argument, there's no way that the symbols in the program can stand for anything. They're strictly uninterpreted formal symbols. So the idea that what we've got is both Freud and AI are concerned with symbols, that's a pun on the word symbol, because in the AI sense of symbol, namely an uninterpreted formal counter, they're not symbols at all.
Well, when Rutherford said the atom was a planetary system, he didn't mean that the thing in the middle was emitting light.
Yeah, but there you go again with the metaphor. Of course, metaphors are often useful. The difficulty is at some point we want to know what is literally true. Now, I want to say, as far as we know anything about it, Freud has got one thing, whatever his other faults are, literally right. Namely, human beings are symbolic animals. They use some things to stand for other things. That is not captured in AI.
Well, he's got it right, but because he's stating it, and we all agree that it's true at an intuitive level, what he hasn't provided, and what I think, with the possible exception of your good self, no philosopher since has provided, is a universally accepted, clear, complete account at the philosophical level of just what intentionality is, and that we're still waiting for.
But there is a further difficulty here. You apparently recognize that there is some phenomenon which you think Professor Searle hasn't quite got right. You do recognize its existence.
Indeed.
Now, whether or not it's yet been clarified, I take it the dispute between you is whether or not it can in fact be explained in terms of programs and computer simulation. And I'm not
the
very
idea that
clear
it's
you
got to
think
be
it can,
universally accepted.
Well, I wouldn't want to say,
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd want to say it quite as strongly as that. I'd certainly be prepared to say that I think that it's likely that we'll develop our understanding of it better by thinking about it in these terms.
But that's another promissory note.
Oh, for sure it's a promissory note. Science is full of them.
Yeah, but what we're interested in is, what do we know? What can we actually
what we're
say with
interested
some
in
confidence?
is, what can we find out and how?
And what is the best way to proceed? Now, I am saying, and I think you agree with me, the best way to proceed must involve the examination of intentionality.
Yes.
And you also agree with me, no program has intentionality.
Yes, but I also say that no atom is really a solar system.
But we don't need it to be a solar system, because what we do is study the atom on its own terms, and precisely what I'm recommending is we better start studying intentionality on its own terms and not in terms of some currently fashionable mechanical analogy. So I really don't see any basis for a disagreement between us if you really agree with me that intentionality is the subject matter of psychology. There's no way AI can deal with intentionality except by analogy.
Well, science moves by analogy.
And sometimes it moves forward, and sometimes it moves forward by making literal investigations of the phenomena at hand. I like your analogy with Rutherford, because if we just tried to investigate the atom by looking at the solar system, we wouldn't have got very far. At some point, you have to actually look at the atom.
True.
Now, I am saying, if you want to investigate intentionality, you won't get very far, you're not likely to get very far, just by doing simulations and analogs. You better look at the phenomenon itself.
Yes,
So
but
to look at the thing just slightly differently. We have this fundamental feature of our mental life, which you both appear to agree on, that is intentionality. Taking something, I mean, one might speak of it, I suppose, in terms of aboutness or directedness, as indeed Professor Searle does. Now, we clearly have that feature, and he says computers don't have it, or programs don't have it. And you tend to come back and say, well, nonetheless, they are rather useful ways of approaching the solution of that problem. And it keeps sounding a little bit as if you think they come a bit close to taking something stand for something else, or come a bit close to directing themselves onto an object.
Well, I don't think they do when they are just programs that are rules for manipulating formal patterns, which don't have any causal plugging into the world. But I think that when they do have a causal plugging into the world, and there are already a few examples of this, then they do really begin to have something which is interestingly closer to intentionality. And I also think that the human mind seems to me to be a very good bet, at least from the methodological point of view, that the human mind is such that overlying the basic causal grounding in the transducers and the voluntary action and so on and so forth, there are mental processes going on, and the best way that we currently have of thinking about just what those mental processes might be specifically and how they work and in what order they work and so forth are computations similar in nature in significant ways to the sorts of computations that you have even in current formal programs, like, for instance, Shank's program that you mentioned right at the beginning.
Let me just respond to that. It seems to me I'm really having some trouble getting your theory into focus, because I thought you agreed in the beer can phase of our argument that if the beer can had the right causal relations on the right input and output, then it would have to have all the intentionality that human beings have. I thought that was agreed on. And your only objection to that was you wouldn't feel morally about beer cans the way you feel about other people. And I wouldn't feel morally about them either, because I think it's obvious that they don't have any conscious thoughts and feelings or unconscious thoughts and feelings. Okay, now it seems to me your position is weaker than the beer can phase, because now it seems to me you're saying, well, we sort of get the best available way of studying intentionality by doing this. But now that is not really the same thesis. Indeed, it doesn't look like it's consistent with it.
The strong AI thesis isn't my thesis. So,
yeah, but I thought you accepted it in the beer can phase of our discussion. But now then, the second objection I wanted to make is not just that the position is inconsistent, but that it begs the question precisely to say the best way of studying it is to study formal computer analogs. That's what's in dispute. What I'm saying is, no, there are two better ways of studying it. One is study the phenomena itself. Picking up your example, Rutherford would have made a mistake if he'd stuck looking at the solar system instead of investigating atoms.
Yes, but
let's study the phenomena of intentionality themselves. And secondly, another way to study it is to study how it actually works in the brain, what the actual causal basis in the brain. But now if you've got those two, you actually got a study of intentionality on its own terms, and you got a study of its causal basis in the brain, then what would be the grounds for saying the best way to study intentionality would be to study its analogs?
Well, the point is, of course, Rutherford would have got nowhere if he'd only looked at the planetary system. What he did was to look at the atom, but in looking at the atom, he made use of the concepts he already had, which referred to the planetary system. So that's the analogy.
So it's nice to have an analogy to start off.
And the second thing is,
once we get started, then we can forget about the analogy and go on to the real thing.
I mean, it seems to be a very important point to make. Of course, you must look at the brain, of course. And one of the interesting things about Ma, for example, who we've mentioned, is that he makes a concerted attempt. I mean, never mind whether it's successful, he makes a concerted and serious attempt to link what he says with what's known and what might be hypothesized about neurophysiology at a very detailed level. Now, it seems to me what you have to ask about the brain is not just what happens on the causal physical level, if you like, between this neuron and that, but what mental processes, what psychological processes I would like to say what computational processes, but anyway, what functions are these causal processes subserving? That's what we have to ask. And that is not a question which can be posed at the purely physical level. It's a question which is posed at the psychological level. And it's a question where, again, I can only repeat what I've said before. It seems to me that a very promising way of posing those very questions is by making use of some of the concepts that have been given to us by computer science and AI.
Well, let me just respond to that briefly by advancing another research project. One way to start off on any serious research project is ask yourself, well, what do you know so far? So that we can then use that as a springboard into the unknown. Well, two things we know so far is we have brains and they produce mental states, and we have mental states with intentionality, and they are responsible for our behavior. Now, it seems to me that right there gives you a research program. It tells you, okay, if you want to understand psychology, you're going to have at least two levels to work on. The brain, how does it work in the plumbing, and intentionality, how does it work at the level of mental states, whether conscious or unconscious. Now, if somebody then says, aha, but you should devote most of your effort to a third level, not the best way, I use your expression here, to study this is neither to get into the brain nor to study the intentionality, but to study this intermediate level of the program. I would say there isn't any reason to suppose that that promissory note is the one that's going to have the biggest payoff. Now, of course, it's possible that anything might develop. But if we're just looking at what we now know and what is the most intelligent way to place our resources, it seems to me we're much better off proceeding to study the matter at hand, namely intentionality and its basis in the brain.
Well, we're betting on different horses.
Thank you, Professor Boden. Thank you, Professor Searle. Good night.
Such an abrupt end.
I know. This is okay. First of all, we got to do this more often because this was a lot of fun. Like I feel like we did around the time my Hitchens book came out, we did a bunch of like Hitchens God debates, but like otherwise it's like almost all politics in one form or another, and this was like refreshing. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, I agree.
I also did want to call attention to something that Charles said in the chat, which I thought was like a really good point, where he says, studying the phenomenon itself, I wonder what that would mean. Searle wasn't exactly a phenomenologist, right? So it's like, okay, I understand saying we should study physical brains, right? Like I get that part. But like when he's saying, oh, you should study intentionality, it sounds like, how though? Like what does that consist of?
Well, apparently he wrote a book about it, I suppose, at the time.
Okay.
And actually, the other thing, I also flagged that comment from Charles because, he reminded me actually that, interestingly, Searle was in the same department at Berkeley, I think, with Herbert Dreyfus, who was a phenomenologist, and also wrote books, including What Computers Can't Do. And he actually wrote a whole argument about like a critique of strong AI, but from a phenomenological perspective, presumably based on intentionality. So I don't know if Searle, although interestingly, apparently they didn't collaborate or talk much because obviously Dreyfus was interested in Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and all these phenomenologists, and Searle wasn't really that interested in them. But I was also curious about exactly in what sense they were using the word intentionality when they were arguing about it, because on the one hand, yeah, there's the phenomenological version of it, but yeah, like what does he mean? So I don't know his work on intentionality, but I guess at the time of recording, he had just come out with a book on it. So, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, like on the face of it, it's. I mean, as you say, he wrote a book about it. We'd have to check out the book, but I mean, on the face of it, it's an odd thing to say. Like I get, intentionality, or you're referring to things. Although also I should say I thought it was super interesting that he conceded that that you could have intentionality without consciousness, because very often the way he talks about these things makes it sound like he's using those almost interchangeably.
Yeah, that was interesting. It went by really quickly, I think, where they both kind of agreed on that. Unless I missed something, I'm not exactly sure.
They did. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, usually when Searle explains this stuff, I mean, he toggles back and forth like as if it's almost interchangeable between talking about syntax and semantics on the one hand and talking about consciousness on the other hand. So the fact that he is willing to make that distinction does make me wonder a little bit, because that seems to be so central to his explanation of AI not, like computationally devised AI not being conscious.
Yeah, and I also wonder if the intentionality thing is like if he let go of that, because I do remember watching some of his talks. I think he did like a TED talk, and he also, the Kurzweil thing that I mentioned before, I think he one time did a talk at Google, the Google talks, and Ray Kurzweil was like right in the front row, and they like got into it during that debate. And I know that, or during his lecture anyway, in the question and answer period. And I know that in both those cases, he doesn't talk about intentionality, but he does talk about studying the brain. Like he always is like, the neuroscientists need to get to work so we can understand how the brain works, because that's the only way we're going to figure out how to create a machine that can think or whatever, is to figure out exactly how the brain's doing it. So I don't know if that's still, so he maybe let go of the whole intentionality thing, or maybe he just thinks it's not worth debating in a kind of public lecture or talking about it in that setting.
Yeah, they do have YouTube channels to follow. We'll do that at the end, but yes, the answer is yes. Yeah, I like Tom from Yakubia's suggestion that the phenomenon itself is best studied for phrenology.
Yeah, I also liked somebody who said something about having to comfort my beer cans as they're triggered by Searle's callous erasure of their lived experience. R. Taylor said that. That was a great one. It was interesting. I noticed a lot of the chat kind of lighting up in response to sort of the demeanor of the debate. That Searle was getting pretty spicy and kind of interrupting and cutting off Boden a little bit, although I didn't find it like that bad. There were certainly a couple of moments where I was like, "Ugh, let her finish, man!" Like, geez.
Yeah. Some of those died. Yeah, I agree. He did get too over. I mean, I agree. It wasn't all that bad, but like
I've seen worse examples for sure. And it was the '80s. Not that that's an excuse, but but yeah, like for the time, it may have been for the
time, I'm surprised you let her talk that much. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think he made a good point though when he kind of pushed her on like what her position actually is, because it was ambiguous. Like it seemed like she would just adopt this perspective of wanting to defend a kind of strong AI view. But then she would be like, well, I'm not really committed to that. But then it wasn't always clear to me exactly what she was committed to, because she also seemed to be like, well, in principle, we could have strong AI, but I don't think it's likely, or like, I don't think it's going to happen, but it's in principle it is. And then
I can understand that if that had all been all she was saying. I feel like I could understand her position a little bit more. Like that's a reasonable thing to say. You could say that like, there are probably lots of things you might say that about, right? Like if you think, I don't know, like time travel is, maybe possible in principle, but I'm, fairly confident that it's not going to be devised.
True.
But again, I mean, I don't necessarily know that I have a lot of new stuff to say about this, but like where that got really confusing for me was when she kept trying to bring morality into it somehow.
Yeah, it also kind of confused me. Like Victor said, I mean, it just seemed like she was sort of like pivoting in her position a little bit. Like it seems like towards the beginning, she wants to say, yes, strong AI is in principle possible and the beer cans would be conscious. And then later on, it seems like she shifts more to saying like, well, no, I just think that like the AI to mind comparison is like a useful analogy that we can use for purposes of like inquiry. So I'm not exactly sure which her position was, or if she shifted it, or if there was something I was missing. But yeah,
that was interesting, because that seemed to be kind of like what the last third or quarter of the debate was about like whether it's useful analog to learn about consciousness, and that was when they got caught up in this Rutherford, Bohr Rutherford model of the atom.
Yeah, I guess in the 80s that was a little bit less anachronistic.
Yeah. But I don't know. I felt like, I guess it's useful in certain narrow contexts, but yeah, I mean, I think I mostly agreed with Searle, and I think it's true that it can lead, like, I think he's right that there can be a risk if you like use the computational model as an analogy, that it'll like make you maybe accept all kinds of assumptions by using that analogies. Like, and I was thinking also about all the examples today, algorithms and machine learning and all these things, the kind of language, the words we're using to talk about these things are getting ever more, in a way, like humanized in a certain sense. And I mean, it is amazing what some of these algorithms can do with, like, the art AI or whatever, the Google thing. But I mean, it seems to me it's still obviously working under the same paradigm of just more complicated way of symbol manipulation.
Yeah, I mean, the pushback would be okay. But we're not just doing really complicated symbol manipulation, and I mean, I know you're in Searle's position as we're not, or I mean, that's not all we're doing, right? Because there's also intentionality, which I guess on the Searle position must be that it's like a necessary but not sufficient condition for consciousness, and then something, I don't know, like, again, it's really hard to. Like, I think that the sort of negative position, like he's at his most convincing sounding when he's like, no, it doesn't work the way that you guys think it does. But then, like, I'm not sure that he has much of a positive account waiting. He's like, something about brains,
biochemical processes.
Yeah, look into that. See if you find anything.
Yeah, Searle's view always just sounded like, I haven't like read enough of what he's had to say to like be able to give an actual criticism, but it just always sort of, a lot of the times when I listen to him talk, it almost just sounds like he's just trying to like sidestep the hard problem of consciousness without like really addressing it. Like, if the hard problem is just like, how is this irreducibly subjective private qualitative stuff reducible to like physical stuff? And Searle's just like, it just arises out of it, no stranger than a pancreas, problem solved. But I've just never found that, like, just feels like he's kind of avoiding it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Like, I remember, I feel like Searle has like just this great like stockpile of good lines about this that might not actually add up to a convincing answer. Like, because I remember, like, kind of along the lines of what Victor was bringing up earlier about, accusing like AI fanatics of Cartesianism. Like, I remember, like, he him having a good line about how it's like, look, man, this isn't like the 17th century. We don't need to be counting up the number of substances, dualist, whatever. I'm not worried about that. It's like, okay, but like, you didn't actually answer the question. Like, it's like a rhetorically pretty good way of not answering the question, but it is still a non-answer to like what Ethan just said. Like, okay, I mean, even in Searle's own terminology, at the end of the debate with Boden, you've got the level of the physical brains, you've got the intentionality stuff you keep talking about, and okay, you think the computation's a distraction. Forget the computation for a second. If we're trying to figure out what your view is, like, do you actually think that the mental stuff is a different thing that's not, like that, like a. I mean, saying that it arises from it seems really unhelpful to me, because it seems like anybody could say that. Like on almost any view, you could say that. Like maybe not any view, but like a lot of views that are really different from each other. You could say that the one arises from the other. But like, once it's arisen, is that like its own thing? Is that... are you describing something non-physical? If so, does it interact with the physical world? That's I don't know. So I don't ultimately know that any of this like clarified for me very much whether I think what I think is true about any of this, but I think that I think Searle has like an at least initially intuitively compelling critique of, functionalism basically, and the consciousness just computation view, and of like the strong AI research program. I think he has like a pretty intuitively compelling critique of that. And then he's got like some stuff he says about his own view, a lot of which, like, yeah, you can tell. I mean, like, he spent a lot of time coming up with these lines, But I don't know how much of a view there is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think last time I saw him, saw like some lecture of his, he just kept talking about how, the consciousness is a biochemical natural process, just like like you said, photosynthesis and digestion. So like, that's like not really a view. That's just like a kind of assumption. But like, I have to say, like, intuitively it's appealing, like that.
Sure.
It's probably a biological process like anything else. And I think like maybe what that captures is, again, his accusation that the AI people are saying that it's something different than biology, that it's like something beyond or something something outside of those processes intrinsically or something. Which I guess, like, even on his view, he does seem to leave room for, right, a non-organic brain of some kind. He just doesn't. He's just like, maybe. He leaves the door open. He just says it can't be computation. So
yeah, well, I think what someone like who's more convinced of, the hard problem being a big thing, like a Chalmers type, what I think they might say with respect to like the pancreas analogy or like the photosynthesis analogy is like, I think the idea would just be that in the case of like the pancreas, when we break down on a deeper level, right, like the individual components of a pancreas and, how it fits into the system that it fits into, or like the kinds of components that make up the pancreas, it sort of makes sense. Like when you put it all together, like intuitively, you can see how the function of the pancreas emerges from its like component parts and so on. But then the idea is just going to be like, you can say that most physical biological systems are weakly emergent in that way, but it seems like more of a mystery how something that's just completely different, like qualitatively, like irreducibly subjective and so on, can come out of physical stuff as opposed to just more complex physical processes coming out of other physical stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like digestion is physical. Like that's like like the thing. It's not just something that is produced by a physical system. It is itself literally a physical process. In fact, like you could like I don't know. I mean, like I think at the current level of technology, it wouldn't actually be very challenging to create something artificial that we would actually refer to as digesting things, and like we'd be comfortable saying that literally is digestion.
true.
Photosynthesis might be harder, but like that's the but like that's still like a well understood physical process, right? Whereas it's like in the case of consciousness, we're talking about, okay, if the physical brain, and then assuming that these are separate things, obviously controversial assumption, but like that's the way Searle talks, that one of these things is produced by or is a process that somehow I don't know exactly. I'd have to reread Searle, but like then now you're talking about a physical thing that's doing this process where the process itself doesn't seem like it can be described in purely physical terms, or whether or not it can be is sort of the issue in dispute.
Yeah. Isn't Ethan, isn't like those qualia deniers, like isn't like the advantage of their view supposedly that like because you're getting rid of qualia, then now everything is just a natural process? So like on their view, wouldn't they be able to say, yes, consciousness is just a physical process, just like digestion? Or is that
Right,
one of the
yeah.
advantages of the view, I guess, of eliminating
Yeah.
qualia?
Like the idea is kind of like if you're an illusionist, like it's not like we have qualia. It's not like we're physical systems who have qualia or who experience qualia. It's more like we're physical systems who have certain processes that interact with each other in such a way that we end up being an organism that where it seems as though we have qualia. And then the question is going to be like, well, isn't seeming like itself a qualitative notion? I think at least like Keith Frankish would want to say that by seeming, he's just going to like cash out that in sort of like functionalist terms. Like when he says it seems as though we have consciousness, he means like we form beliefs and react as though we had consciousness. So like when we introspect, we have the belief that we have consciousness. We react in certain ways as though we had consciousness, but in fact, all there is like really complicated interactions between physical systems that gives rise to that impression. And then it's like, if that's your view, then while how does this subjective, irreducibly qualitative thing arise out of physical processes? That seems like a really hard question, but how does a physical process that reacts and believes as though it has consciousness? That's because we're not actually positing the irreducibly subjective stuff. That ends up being like a easier question, as long as you're more comfortable with like the bullet bite of qualia not existing.
Yeah, that's a big bullet to bite.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of feels like Matt actually. Despite having gone over his crimes earlier, I'm actually going to quote Colin again to agree with him. I remember once in class he said something about panpsychism, which is the view that like literally everything is conscious, and it's like somehow this like feature of any kind of physical reality. And he was like, yeah, it solves a lot of problems. It's very elegant. The only problem with it is that's obviously not true.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like that's like the opposite of view almost of the I guess illusionist view is like the panpsychist view in a way, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's Philip Goff, who's like a famous panpsychist, and Keith Frankish, who's a famous illusionist, have like a podcast together. And I think the intro is like, I think consciousness is everywhere. He thinks consciousness is nowhere. And then like they do their thing.
That's a nice, that sounds like a wholesome podcast.
Yeah. Speaking of Colin McGinn.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you've seen his website, but the homepage of his website is like a big dramatic picture of his face with like a quote from Steven Pinker about how he's an ingenious philosopher who thinks like a laser and writes like a dream. So
wow.
Oh yeah, man. I used to, when the original McGinn scandal was going on in like 2013, I used to check out I think he has a much fancier website now. I used to check out his blog very regularly. Sort of car crash fascination with the whole thing as it was unfolding. But it has been a minute. But yeah, here we have it. The kid is the genius they philosopher, like a laser who writes like a dream.
Well, it's funny. I'm seeing his blog. He's very active. Like he's writing articles on his blog, like almost. Yeah, it looks like at least weekly, if not oftentimes a lot more. So I don't know. He must still have an audience.
I guess so, man. Now I'm curious at wow. All right. Yeah,
yes.
tennis. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, it does look like he's fallen off a little in the last couple of weeks, but yeah, that is a very active blog presence. I have to admit, so he also wrote a novel, which is not very good. It's called Bad Patches, and it's it's self-published, and in fact I know for a fact that the research assistant at the heart of that scandal, helped to prepare that for self-publication. Although I think he'd written it many years before, but I did something really mean-spirited back in 2013, which is that I did this thing where I had since this was 2013, I did this on Facebook. I posted every day for like a month, like an extra.
Oh,
Ben froze.
Yeah, froze for me too.
Okay, yeah.
Well, there we are. You're back now, but you did.
Yeah. So I did the 40 days of bad patches because the quotes were just hilariously awful. But when he's writing about philosophy, he's much better.
That's have you seen Colin McGinn's reply to Michael Huemer by any chance?
I have not seen Colin McGinn's
Oh.
reply to Michael Huemer.
It's really brutal. Apparently, Michael Huemer was at like a seminar, a seminar that Michael Ginn was like teaching at, and Colin McGinn, and Michael Huemer like kept making comments, and eventually Colin McGinn told him that his comments were stupid, and then Michael Huemer went around like admonishing Colin McGinn for that, and Colin McGinn wrote up this like short little blog post about it where he says, let me see, it's up right here. Okay, it says, "You are quite correct in your quotation of my words to you. I did indeed say that your comment at the time was stupid. Why did I do that? Because I thought it was stupid and just one instance of a train of stupid comments you had made."
Oh man, this is recent. This is October 2021.
Wow. That's funny.
No, that is you know, I think I think that humor is like very wrong about all of the subjects that I know of him having opinions about. I've never heard one that I thought was plausible, but I do, out of the two, I do kind of trust him to be the one to like actually be like earnestly trying to stick to the arguments, and McGinn to kind of be doing like sort of to be doing just like kind of like snide stand-up comedy about like how dumb he thought humor was being. Like that does sound much more like both of them.
Yeah, that's funny.
He would do a lot of that. Like I remember in the class I took from him, he did the thing. Like I mean, again, like there is a certain kind of skill that McGinn had. He was really good at it. Where he would, what it reminded me of was nothing so much as like if you've ever seen like on PBS, they'll show from the BBC the Prime Minister's Question Time in the UK, and like the way that like I remember watching Tony Blair do this back when, that like he was like really really good at just like sort of parrying the comments that like members of Parliament would throw at him, to like criticize him, and just like having like one-liners to respond to them with, and yeah, I mean McGinn did have something, that talent. I remember him doing like once somebody, he was explaining his view about consciousness, which is basically that it's unknowable, like that like where it's beyond our capacity to figure out how consciousness works, which is this probably a much more sophisticated way of expressing that than I know about. But he's sort of explaining it, and a friend of mine made the mistake of saying, I don't know, I've been reading this book by Daniel Dennett, Consciousness Explained. I actually think it's a pretty plausible account. I just remember McGinn doing this like very well-timed pause, be like, "Well, you're the only one."
Wow.
It's like such
Vicious.
a horrible thing to do as like pedagogy, but it was funny.
Wow, vicious. This guy sounds like he's consistently pretty vicious.
He was pretty consistently pretty vicious. Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry. Here's the here. I'll drop it into chat. There's the reply. Yeah, I don't know. So yeah, I think I guess my last thought about the substance of the debate itself, and then if you guys have any last thoughts, we can do that, and then kind of move towards wrapping up. Is I know I've like already brought this up like 3 times. I'm just gonna keep this like real succinct, but like the thing that, so it seemed like Boden's view was it's possible in principle that if we could be better than we maybe ever will be at like figuring out the computational structure of human consciousness and at figuring out what the right causal inputs and outputs are, then we could have strong AI. Even if we can't figure that out, it's still a useful thing to study, because studying computational systems can at least help us understand how the human ones work, and so that could be like a useful thing for studying cognitive science. And then the part that I find all of that I understand. Like, I don't know if it's right or not, but like I can understand all of that. The part that I cannot for the life of me understand is, but for moral reasons, we shouldn't say that we shouldn't like award the designation of consciousness to artificial intelligence even in the future, which is like, which if anything, I mean, not only does that like even bringing out morality seem like a huge non sequitur when we're just trying to figure out what's true about this, but like also, if anything, I mean, if you are like, I don't know, I mean, thinking about moral considerations would impel me in exactly the opposite direction. That it's like if I thought that like there was like a 10% chance that I think the robots, you know, were like actually having conscious experiences and like resented being enslaved, like I would like, you know, I'd be like, oh shit, we actually should start treating them just in case as if they really are conscious. Like, you know, shouldn't we err on the side of assigning them moral status?
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. It seems like a very weird reflection, or like a very weird approach to like reflective equilibrium, where it's like have this view that like machines don't matter, have this view that machines could probably be conscious. So instead of like revising one of those principles, you just like, they are conscious, but they're not, you know? So it's very strange.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. I have like some sympathy because I assume that it's probably some like well thought out view that she has, but she's like, this debate's not the right place for me to bring it up. But like, yeah, it's such a strange claim that like it makes me. In fact, I was just looking at her Wikipedia page to try to figure out like what the source of that view, or if she's published on that view, because it is very puzzling. But yeah, I can't find. I mean, initially I was thinking to myself, well, is she like, you know, the only thing like speculatively, right? I was like, well, maybe she's got some like religious commitments that make her want to say that like even if an AI, but like that doesn't seem to be the case because she invoked the category of evolution before, right? So like that would at least suggest, I mean, it still could be, and nothing on her Wikipedia page at least is making it seem like she's got some kind of religious commitments. So must be some view there that we're not seeing. So
fair enough. Well, at least people have a reading list to go with to figure out in greater depth what all these people think. But yeah, this was a lot of fun for sure. So I should say that the main show, we are going to do an episode on Monday, actually possibly with Adnan, who's in the chat, Professor Adnan Hussein. That's still being worked out, but one way or the other, we are doing some kind of show on Monday. Obviously, we're not doing a Thursday night to break down on Thanksgiving. And then we're doing another episode, and then probably mostly going to be off during December. We have not announced the date yet, and this is not going to be the time that I do it in the last minute of this, but we do have a live show coming up in New York. So when we have we will probably be doing some live stuff to promote that during December, but mostly the regular shows can be off in December. But sometime in January, you guys have to come back, do another philosophy one. This is a lot of fun. But meanwhile, the people want to know where they can find the two of you. So Ethan, you want to start?
Yes, I have a YouTube channel now called Confronting Capital. So you can find me there. I've been a little bit held up recently. I've been trying my best to prepare for this a couple panels that I'm going to this weekend in Texas that will be streamed on the Modern Day Debate platform. And yeah, but after that, I have a bunch of stuff that I want to record, mostly about Cohen.
Very nice.
Yeah, that'll be cool. So you can find me. I'm on the Plastic Pills podcast. I'll send Ben a link to it. It's youtube.com/pillpod.
Nice.
So yeah, we just talk about philosophy and critical theory and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a good time. People should definitely check both of those out. Looking forward to seeing. Thank you. Yep, I will indeed put that in the description. Looking forward to seeing Ethan. I believe his very first in person debates in Texas. Streaming on Modern Day Debates. That should be a lot of fun. Charles, if you're talking about the Give Them a Revolution show in Los Angeles, we put that out in podcast form for patrons. It's not in the public podcast feed, but that is a very good cue. If you are not already, patreon.com/Ben Burgis. Get the patron exclusive post games after every regular Monday night episode. Get access to the Discord server. Sometimes you get episodes, interviews in advance, sometimes well in advance of when we put them out on the public YouTube channel. But all of this, of course, these are just sort of things we do as gestures of appreciation. The real thing is that this is, this is a, it's not a subscription service. It's a gesture of solidarity. If you like what we're doing here and you want to keep it going, and so the most important thing you get in exchange is love. So. Please consider signing up as a patron. Meanwhile, we will be back on Monday. Check out both of these good people. Check out Ethan in Texas. Check out Plastic Pills, and we will leave it there for tonight. Left is best.